today we apply our theology of the body that we've been kind of journeying through over these last 3 weeks, this being our fourth, of that total vision of the human person according to God, which has been, marred by sin in our world and the difficulties and struggles of it. And so to have this God's vision of why we're created male and female, why we're called to a communion of persons and to love, right? We need to understand that. And so how do we live that out in the world? That's what we want to look at today. What are those ways that we live that out? And so we know that Jesus takes us back to the beginning to see God's intention, right? This beautiful gift of self that we're called to give to the other. And in many ways, sin enters in right in the middle of that, right in between that relationship. And then that's the world that we live in, right? That's broken by sin, that we struggle to see and to live what God calls us to. And what is it that he calls us to? This gift of self, right, for love of another. Now, it's a specific way within the context of marriage, and then other ways outside of that. And we know that all of this is meant to point us to the heavenly marriage, right? That God wants to be united with us. There is nothing more profound than that. Like, I say the words and I pray about that often, but I can't even grasp what the beautiful meaning of that is. I think it takes a lifetime of entering into this deep relationship with the Lord to continually open up that beautiful gift. And so you've really got these two images. You got the earthly marriage that is pointing us, is a sign and meant to be a sign, to the heavenly marriage. And therefore, John Paul explains that the two main ways of living out the theology of the body is through celibacy for the kingdom and marriage, right? And oftentimes our world, which again, like the whole point of this is to give us a better biblical worldview and not a secular worldview, which we're all kind of imbued with in many different ways in our culture. But they're not opposites, right? They're two sides of the same coin, right? My life is not less because I have given up the earthly marriage to point to and be a sign of in this world the heavenly marriage. I've had many conversations with folks, and especially normally non-Catholics. They just cannot understand celibacy, right? They can't get me. They don't understand it. They're like, but why? Why? And I was like, look, it's not for everyone. As Jesus tells us when he talks about this, it's for those who have been called to it, that they should say yes, right? And my life is not lacking in love. Right, just one little example for you of this week was Catholic Schools Week. And on Friday, I went over to do something at the school, and Mrs. Keene gave me this basket of gifts. And they were like, everybody had written me a card, all the kids. Like, I'm not lacking in love. It's a beautiful, it was very moving. I still haven't read them all. There are like hundreds of them that I need to read. But there's no lacking in love because you called me father for a reason, right? There's spiritual fatherhood, there's spiritual motherhood, as we see in the gift of religious life as well, but also just in general in the world, right? That all men are called to a spiritual fatherhood and women are called to a spiritual motherhood, right? There's this gift of how God has created us, male and female, to live that out in different ways. And so celibacy is one of those ways that's pointing to the heavenly marriage for us. That's saying that sign of marriage, earthly marriage, that points to heaven, I begin to live that now with the grace of God. One time, one of my family members said, but it's not natural. I said, you're correct. It's supernatural. It's a call. No way I could do it without God's grace. Right? Because we're made for that earthly marriage as well. And so it takes that beautiful gift of celibacy for the kingdom, as St. John Paul calls it, to point us to the fact that your earthly marriage is meant to be pointing there as well. And that's the fulfillment of it. And then, of course, we understand marriage to a certain extent, but do we understand it with God's eyes? Now, this is the difficult part, right? Because our world, since the beginning, has struggled with this, right? We struggle to trust in God's vision, and sin makes it difficult. So I'm going to give you the vision of God and what he calls us to today, but I want you to recognize there's need for mercy and love in the midst of this, right? Because it's not always easy to hear God's vision of things. It's difficult at times. But this is a proposal, not an imposition. God proposes this beautiful thing to us and says, trust me and walk into this. Even when we fail, get back up and walk into it. So what is it? We see it right in the vows of marriage itself, right? That free, total, faithful, fruitful. That's how marriage takes place on the earthly realm. And actually, it's what Jesus shows us, right? It didn't just come from the earthly living out of it. Jesus shows us the love that God calls us to in marriage or in celibacy by what he did on the cross. He freely gave himself for us. He didn't have to. He freely did that out of love. And he totally gave himself. Every last drop of blood offered on the cross for our redemption, for our salvation. He could have done it in 1,000 ways that were much easier than what he did. And this faithfulness, right? Jesus says, I am faithful to the end. I am faithful to you. I do not give up. And you see that throughout the whole of the Bible. Even when Israel falls in the Old Testament over and over and over again, God never gives up on them. He always comes back with a new covenant. Finally, God himself establishing that covenant in Jesus when he comes. And then the fruitfulness of Christ's sacrificial love on the cross, right? That fruitfulness continues to bear fruit in our lives today through the sacraments, right? We already begin to experience a heavenly marriage through the sacraments. That's amazing, especially the Eucharist, which is the source and summit of all things, right? Because we're being united each time we receive Jesus, we're being united to God. We're becoming more and more like him, right? So that's the vision of love that God has for marriage. And obviously you realize you couldn't enter into a marriage if you were forced, right? You can't force someone to love you. So it has to be freely chosen by each person. And then you have to enter into it totally, which is not easy for us broken people, right? Us who struggle with sin. We struggle with selfishness. That's why what God's love is self-giving, right? I mean, just think of Jesus for a moment, right? How many times is he rejected throughout the centuries, right? This greatest act of love, and we do it, and people that don't know Jesus, they do it, they reject that love, right? But he doesn't stop him from doing it, right? He still gives completely of himself. And so we're called to give ourselves totally in marriage to that other person. For me, totally to the church, right? I'm married to the church, and I'm meant to give myself totally of that. And I fail on a daily basis, right? Because we all struggle with that selfishness that comes up in our heart. Like, oh, I don't want to do this. I want to do what I want to do, right? Is that just me, or does everybody else experience that occasionally? Okay, right? It happens. That's the struggle. That's why we need grace, why we need the sacraments and prayer to help us to give more and more each day. That's my goal, to try to give more of myself each day to Christ and his church, right? And then the fruitfulness, right? We have to allow God to let us be fruitful in the way that he's created us for, in spiritual ways, but also in physical ways within marriage, to be open to the fruitfulness of God, to bring life into the world. And that same goes for in a spiritual way as well, right? To be fruitful in preaching the gospel. It was by providence that we have St. Paul's reading today, right? He's like, woe is me if I don't preach the gospel. I feel that. But the gospel is difficult in this world, right? Many times when we preach the gospel or we live the gospel, in a world that's really gone wrong, we're looked at weird. We're maybe even rejected or ostracized because we preach the fullness of the gospel. But what else are we going to do? That's what we're called to. We're called to bear fruit, whether that's in our marriage or whether that's in our preaching and living out of the gospel. Both of those are connected, right? And to not bear fruit, to be afraid to preach the difficulties of the Christian life, to be afraid to trust the Lord, even with our fertility within marriage. It's not easy, right? We've had 60 years of a world telling us the opposite thing, right? Control, control, control. But we're not in control. The more we can give to the Lord, the more we can say, Lord, okay, I'm going to take this next step with you. I'm scared, right? There's always that. But Jesus is faithful, right? He's trustworthy, and it's worth it. There's a freedom that comes from living as God calls us to, a freedom that cannot be found anywhere else, no matter how much we try to control it. And oftentimes, I think maybe even in this last year, and the many things that we've recognized, actually, I'm not in control of a lot of things in my life, right? There's a lot of need and deepening of trust with the Lord. It's not easy. It's difficult to live out this free, total, faithful, fruitful love in whatever vocation we're called to. It's tough. But each one of us are called to take that next step with the Lord and say, okay, Lord, this is where I'm having trouble. Help me, right? I want to trust you deeply. I want to give you my entire self and give myself to others in this way so that we can live the love that God has created us for. So it's tough, right? Maybe we've failed a lot. Maybe we've bought into many of the lies of the culture. That's all of us, right? We're all there. We've all struggled with that. But go with the Lord today. Invite him into your heart right where you are and say, Lord, I love you. Help me to say yes to this type of love, which, as we can see from the cross, is painful, is difficult, is pretty much a crucifixion of our own selfishness. But it's a good thing in the end because it brings about life, true life, spiritual and human. And this is the beautiful gift that God has given us, this beautiful gift of earthly marriage that points us to heaven, all right, to the heavenly marriage that each one of us are called to. And that is the fulfillment of our deepest desires of our heart. All right, so remember, we've got these disordered and twisted up desires in our heart. These are what we bring to the Lord within marriage, within celibacy, within the single life, wherever it is. We bring them to the Lord. And little by little, through his grace, through a prayer, through the sacraments, he begins to untwist them to help us live this very difficult but very beautiful call to love as God loves.